Once again, I would like to acknowledge, I know we already did, but especially when you see when I get into this talk why it's important, I'd like to once again acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And it's our privilege to work, live, play, and today have this conversation on this land. Right, so this talk, like so many other things in my life, came from a moment of being angry and having that move me to change something. Last year, in November, in 2016, I was going through my morning ritual, which usually involves coffee, watching Stephen Colbert's monologue from the night before, and reading Canadian headlines. I noticed that the Canadian government had made some changes, that they had passed the expansion of Enbridge Line 3 and the Kinder Morgan pipeline. This was not the first time that the Canadian government had done something to overstep their relationships with the nations on whose land they were on, but it was the first time that I was so deeply affected by this. To understand why, I have to go back and tell you a little bit about my context. I was born and raised in Ontario, so I benefit from the treaties there. And I'm a product of the public school system there. So when I was growing up, every morning I sang that this was my home and my native land. I was given a history. We had a school song which literally talked about how pioneers came to this land and they cleared the bush and built their homes, and that's what we see there in Ontario. And I was very much taught that this place that was mine was completely empty until white people came and made it what it is for me to live on. It wasn't until I got to university and I was studying children and young people that I came to see that time and time again, it was young Indigenous people who were the most marginalized in Canada. I was genuinely surprised to learn that late in life, and that started my process of unlearning the narrative of Canadian history that I had been taught growing up. As I was unlearning this specific version of Canadian history, I paired it with my lens of having grown up in a Sikh family in a post-84 moment where I had seen how the fight for land and water and self-determination had eventually cost us our lives. Leading up to that November morning, I had watched the incredible Standing Rock Sioux fight for their land and their water and their right to exist. And I had noticed that most of my Sikh brothers and sisters had been silent while this was happening. And I watched on this day in November as well, as again, my Sikh brothers and sisters were silent for what was happening in Canada. I was angry at the people around me, I was angry at the way that I had been taught to look at Canada, and I was angry that it took me this long to start to see some of the parallels. So that is what I'm going to share with you today. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is show you what I saw in my mind as the parallels between the journeys of Sikhs and the journeys of the peoples whose land we are on today. And they basically come down to, when I boil them down into a 20-minute talk, three things: the right to land, the right to water, and the right to self-determination. Okay, so I know that for the folks in here, there's a lot of context, so there's a lot of understanding of what was happening in Punjab. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through this again, but I will highlight some of the main points, starting the story in 1966, when Punjab was broken into three parts as a part of a linguistic reorganization. So Punjab, post-partition Punjab, which was already robbed of so many things, now faced a time where it was turned into three, so Himachal, Haryana, and Punjab, and it hadn't been done very well. Chandigarh became a union territory, which means that it was no longer elected officials from the state, from Punjab, were not taken to Chandigarh, but from the center, people were appointed. And also, during this time, a lot of the power that went with the water in Punjab was transferred to the central government. So this was an issue of what happens with hydropower, what happens with irrigation, what happens with food, where are populations able to live and prosper, what happens with the Ravi Vyas overflow. All of this became decisions of the central government. These state-center relationships were so fraught during that time. And because of that, and because the central government realized this, we saw the power that water has come to the center of the Sikh imagination. and that of the government. So we saw for the first time a clear understanding that whoever controlled water in Punjab controlled a lot of the politics, the economy, the transportation. In 1973, the Akali Dal created the Anandpur Sahib resolution. There were a number of resolutions in there. Amongst them were more representation of Sikhs in the army. We saw that they demanded that Chandigarh be returned to Punjab, and the most important was that certain decisions about water be reversed, and that control around the rivers and the control of the water be given back to Sikh people. In 1982, Sant Janel Singh Bhindranwale took on the Anandpur Sahib resolution, and under the umbrella of the Dharmiyut Morcha, also started to fight for the passing of the revolution. Of these resolutions, which were part of the revolution. So it's all intertwined. This is the story that I knew growing up, but I didn't always understand the why. So I think it's really important to understand why this movement that was started was so important and how it was linked to water. What started out as a peaceful movement, as we know all too well, ended in violence. These issues of land, water, self-determination, sovereignty, identity, language, all became so convoluted that you weren't able to discern one from the other with any amount of ease. It came to the point where asking for your access to your water, asking to make decisions about your own land, could cost you your life. Water is at the center of everything in Sikhi. It is in there's every type of metaphor of water in Gurbani. Water shows up in a lot of Sakhis. It is a part of our death. It's there when you give birth to a newborn, to when you're given Khanderi Ball, whenever that blessing happens for you in life. Water was always at the center of Sikh spirituality, and what we saw when we were fighting for our identity and our lives in Punjab was that water was also at the center of politics. So that brings us to the land that we reside on. I use the umbrella term Indigenous, but there are three categories of Indigenous folks in Canada. So we have the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. There are a lot of different languages that these nations had. So this is a map of Turtle Island pre-colonization. And all of these nations had their own languages, their own child rearing practices. Some of them got along, some of them didn't get along. They had trading agreements with each other. And the reason I'm going to use the language Turtle Island is because although it is still in the colonizer's language, it's still in English. Some of these nations had origin stories in which this land was called, when you translate it into English, was Turtle Island. And it's to bring into your consciousness that this land was something pre-Canada. So Canada is, what we call Canada is only actually historically very recent. Okay, so what we have here are post-Confederacy, the numbered treaties started. The numbered treaties were on behalf of the Crown and were about settling land, about creating agreements. They were done by force, they were done unethically, sometimes they were done in languages that folks didn't understand. In modern times we call them land claims, so they're still happening. But what I want to bring your attention to is where we are right now, BC. You'll notice that there are no numbers. That's because, as I said in the land acknowledgement in the beginning, we are on unceded territory. This land that we are on has never formally been signed over to the Crown. We fully acknowledge, and the city of Vancouver has also acknowledged, that by a motion that was passed in 2014, that the city of Vancouver is on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This is important because not only do we know that what we call Canada, and we operate as if it is Canada here, we know that it belongs to the people who were here before colonization, but now we have formal acknowledgement from our nation as well. So amidst those numbered treaties, in 1876, the Indian Act was passed. The Indian Act is still law today on a federal level, and it's unilateral, which means it doesn't work from nations back toward the federal government. It's how the federal government controlled Indians. I'm using that language because it comes with the Indian Act. There were a lot of laws that came with the Indian Act. Indigenous folks from different nations could not assemble, could not wear their paraphernalia, could not hire a lawyer, could not leave the reserve. If women married someone who was not Indigenous, they would lose their status. There were a lot of violations that went along with this. And in 1844 amendment, the Indian residential school system got started. So this was a formal policy of genocide. Children were taken forcefully from their homes, and this involved different churches, the RCMP, the federal government, obviously, and was at the hands of some of the people that we now compare ourselves to as politicians. They said that these savages should not be raised by their savage parents. They should be taken out and raised by the white man. It was an attempt to take the Indian out of the child. Children were taken forcefully. Their ears were cut off. They were beaten for speaking their own languages. They were physically and sexually abused, and at some point, in some cases, they never made it back home. This is important because this past year in Canada, we once again had to defend that this was genocide. There was a senator who said that they weren't that bad, that people had good experiences in them. They have been recognized by survivors and also by the Canadian government as a formal act of genocide. The last residential school closed in 1996. So again, we're not talking about way back when. 1996, residential schools were still open. The largest class action lawsuit against the Canadian government was brought on by the survivors of residential schools. They were successful, and to date, $1.6 billion in compensation have been provided to the survivors in two forms. One is a common experience payment, so anyone who went to residential school gets compensation, and the second is an independent assessment if there's some way of tracking that you were physically or sexually abused. Those survivors allocated $60 million of their own compensation to fund the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Again, really important to take note of because the work that's been done wasn't done by the Canadian government. Stephen Harper didn't wake up one day and decide that Canada had done a bad thing and he was going to apologize for the Indian residential school system. This was the folks who had survived this bringing the government to their knees and having to admit that they had done something wrong. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Justice Murray St. Clair, did incredible work, collected stories, went to different communities, different peoples, different nations, traveled, and then created the 94 calls to action, which is also incredible. The Anand Prasad resolution was such a monument to consensus building in our month, and in the same way, the 94 calls to action are these incredible calls that have come together when people actually sit down and work together and tell their stories. This is also from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is where we get the language of genocide. So we say that there was a cultural genocide. It's important to call it genocide. Just as there are people who will deny us our experience of genocide and oppression, there are people who will deny Indigenous people their experience of oppression and genocide. What happened to the Indigenous people on this land was genocide at the hands of the Canadian government. The formal genocide and the Indian residential school system was a formal government process, and there have since been informal things that are still happening. The 60s scoop is a name given to a phenomenon during the 60s, which overlapped a little bit with the residential schools, where children were taken out of their homes and put into foster care or adoption because their parents were deemed unfit. And again, they lost their connection to their parents. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma. They lost their language and their culture. So while the formal government process have ended, the informal violence continues. The genocide continues, and the colonization of this land continues, be it through missing and murdered Indigenous women, the suicide epidemic we have on reserves, people who are under boil water advisories, or the funneling of Indigenous people into the criminal justice system. This from Stats Canada in 2006, from Saskatchewan, shows that if you are Aboriginal, you are 30 times more likely to end up in jail than if you are not Aboriginal. We have taken a system of murdering people in schools, shifted it into the child welfare system, and now shifted it into the criminal justice system. It's still happening. Even conversations that we entertain today about is cultural appropriation okay are standing on a violent history of taking people's culture away and silencing them, and that eventually cost them their lives. Cultural appropriation, not okay. Let's move on on how to stop it. Let's stop entertaining that conversation. Okay. So last year, Canada made this big move. They adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This was adopted at the UN General Assembly 10 years ago. For 9 years, Canada on an international stage would not adopt this declaration. The declaration asks the Canadian government, requires the Canadian government to recognize the basic humanity of Indigenous people. So again, we need to question why the Canadian government hesitated for 9 years. But most importantly, says that when creating policy on Indigenous land, they need to have free, prior, and informed consent. While Canada has taken it on, they have said that this free, prior, and informed consent part is hard to actually put into action. So under Section 35 of the Constitution, there is a duty to consult. The difference between the two words, consent and consult. If you need the consent of the people whose land you are on, they can say no. If you are going to consult, you can tell them what you're going to do, and they have no veto power. So this is currently the situation we're in. On an international stage, Canada has agreed to free, prior, and informed consent, and then domestically, we're saying we have a duty to consult, and actually, even though we have it in writing that this is not our land, and we understand that this is not our land, we're still not going to give you the right to say no. This brings me to the issues of pipelines. So again, back to that November morning, what was happening? Kinder Morgan has been approved, the extension to Enbridge 3 has been approved, and the Keystone Pipeline, which under the Obama administration, so the Keystone runs from Canada into US, had been blocked for 8 years. Trump signed an executive order saying that Keystone can go through as well. These pipelines are a complicated issue. I benefit from them. I drive a car, I flew here. They are integral to Canada's economics and infrastructure. And if we don't have them, crude oil will still be moved through trains. And actually, these two pipelines that came forward last year only account for a 0.3% extension of the existing framework of pipelines. So why does this matter? Why am I talking to you about it today? The most important thing to take from this is it's not our decision to make. It does not matter what I think. It does not matter how I understand these pipelines or what the Canadian government thinks and understands about these pipelines. It is not our decision. It is not our land. It is not our decision. We have to follow the lead of the people who we have acknowledged that it is their land and their decision to make. And what do these nations have to say? Again, they are different peoples and communities that have been put under one umbrella term, so there is no one viewpoint on these things. There are some nations that have mutual benefit agreements with some of the pipelines, but there are nations, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning, the ones whose land we are on, who are saying that they do not want these pipelines. The Coldwater Indian Band, the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh currently have a lawsuit against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And while they are fighting for that to be passed and for their voices to be heard, the BC Liberals have received hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from the pipeline and from affiliated organizations. Okay, so what can we do about it? One, we're going to start from this side, is know yourself. Know who you are. That's the beginning of any action that you're going to take. We are settlers. We are guests on this land. And we are settlers of color. So I'm not a white settler. I'm not a European descendant. I'm not French or English. I did not design the genocide. I did not kill Indigenous people. I benefit from it. I am implicated in it. Every single day I am on land that was taken from them, and I get to prosper on that land. And that sucks. And I have to deal with the fact that that sucks. That guilt, that process is mine. I have to take ownership of that. If having privilege in one area doesn't negate that you are oppressed or that you show resistance in another area. So I'm a settler of color. At the same time that I am asking you to own your Canadian identity and to own your settler privilege, we are going to experience a lot of racism based on our color, based on the way that we look. I experience oppression based on my gender. I can hold all of those conflicting identities at the same time. So our work as settlers of color is different than the work of white settlers. So we have to make sure that we don't think that oppression is, there's the oppression Olympics. That if I acknowledge that I have privilege in one area, it's going to take away from my struggle to fight for my own identity in another area. The second thing you do, all the way to that side, is listen. Listen, 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 listen. So if you are on this land and you are trying to figure out what to do, this conversation is about me and my community, so it's being led by me. The part of it that is about deconstructing my own privilege and the privilege of our community has to be done by ourselves. The process about moving forward has to be done by Indigenous people, has to be done by those nations, by the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations. We have to listen to what those nations want and move forward. Decisions cannot be made without free, prior, and informed consent. And the third most important thing is be moved to change. So take that anger and turn it into something real. As I mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a list of 94 calls to action. There is literally a list of 94 things that different peoples have come up with in a collaborative experience. So everyone in this room has homework. You are going to go home and Google Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. You are going to read the 94, pick one, and apply it to your life. There are things in there about law, about child welfare, about education, about sports. So if you are interested in anything, there is a call to action. I am an educator. Call 62 is a call to educators to create new curriculum, to incorporate the experience of residential schools into their curriculum. Most of the calls are to the government, but you can still find one and find a way of having parallels in your life. On July 1st, the Idle No More folks are having a day that is a national day of action. So on this day that we call Canada Day, and throughout this year, as we've been celebrating 150 years of genocide, what they are asking for is, and you can, again, Google Idle No More, Google Day of Action, and find out, listen to their voices, see what they're asking for you to do on that day, and do it. And there is a Walk for Reconciliation happening in 2017. So the way to move forward, in the words that come from the TRC, is reconciliation. Shout out to Simran Singh, who is one of the organizers for this walk. So there are folks in your community who are already doing this work. Show up, work on moving forward in a way that's healing and reconciling. And we should have Nagar Keetan-like numbers at this thing in terms of Sikh representation. But most importantly, know where you come from and know how to understand the Indigenous experience through your Sikh lens. We are uniquely positioned to have empathy. We are prospering as immigrants on this land because someone else is being hurt. We are all going to have different paths here. Some of us are going to be farmers, some of us are going to be teachers, some of us are going to be artists, some of us are going to be, I don't know, professional wrestlers. Whatever it is, which is now, brown people can be professional wrestlers. So whatever it is that you choose that you're going to do, there is going to be a moment in your path, many moments in your path, where you're going to have a choice to make. You are going to be able to progress your individual brand by stepping on Indigenous people. Make those choices consciously. I can't prescribe to you what those things, everyone has a different line, some people have a price, some people don't have a price. But don't let those decisions be made out of apathy. Be conscious when you're making those decisions. And know that you have to work in a way that validates the oppression of the living and honors the memory of the dead, because we too come from a people whose fight for their land and their water eventually cost their lives. Bye.